Melvin, last week, something awesome happened to one random listener. And what was that?
Last week, we gave away a $25 gift card via our Twitter contest.
That's right. And this week, we're doing it again, except not on Twitter. This time, you have the opportunity to win a $25 Amazon gift card by leaving us a rating and review in iTunes. How this works is that when you leave us a 5-star rating review in iTunes, either via your Apple Podcast app or on your desktop, just send us a tweet or an email at loxpodcast@gmail.com with your username that you use on iTunes to leave reviews. Anyone who does that before Friday evening at 6 p.m. on November the 2nd will be entered into a drawing to win that $25 Amazon gift card. Once we have selected a winner, we will reach out to you either via email or Twitter based on how you submitted your entry to us. Additionally, if you have already left us a rating and review in iTunes, you will also be entered into this contest automatically, so don't worry about that. Thank you. Hey, everybody. Before we get into the show today, Melvin and I would just like to tell you how you can support the show.
Don't forget to leave us a 5-star rating in iTunes, write a written review, and tell a friend.
You can follow us on social media. We're The Life of X on Facebook and Instagram, and at Life of X Podcast on Twitter. We're definitely the most active on Twitter, so you should join us. Follow us there. Retweet our tweets.
And head over to our support page at lifeofxpodcast.com.
There you are going to find several options to support the podcast. The first is audible.com. For those of you who don't know what audible.com is, it is the largest purveyor of audiobooks on the internet. I have personally been using it for years. Many of the books that we have used for the podcast can be found on Audible. If you go through our portal on our page, you will receive a free audiobook when you sign up for a monthly subscription, and they will also kick us a few dollars.
You can also support us by going through our portal to Amazon. If you do that, any purchases that you make, we'll get a small kickback.
We've also added a featured book page to the website. Any of you who are interested in actually purchasing the books that we've used, many of which are fantastic books, you can go through there, and that will route you through our Amazon portal to the Amazon page where you can purchase the books. And so, again, we get a few cents off each purchase. Additionally, we've set up a Patreon page, and for those of you who are unaware of what that is, it is a service wherein patrons can pledge a certain amount of money per episode. So every time Melvin and I release an episode, you would send us $1, $2, whatever you can. We would appreciate anything. We have goals set up. We have different tiers so that we can also reciprocate your generosity.
All your dollars help.
That's right. But again, we would just like to say that the most important thing that you can do is rate, review, and tell a friend. Help get our name out there. All right. Enjoy the show.
Thanks, guys.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Arif Jadala.
And I'm Melvin Barnes.
And that makes this The Life of X. Melvin, we are here for part 2 of Steve and Paul Jobs.
Yes, sir.
I would ask you if you had anything new that you wanted to catch up on, except for the fact that we just did that an hour ago.
Yeah, nothing's changed.
I feel like people are going to be like, sometimes they catch up with each other, but other times they don't. And they may not realize that we record more than one of these in a day.
So the only thing that I think we can catch you up on is the fact that we're probably going to have Korean barbecue for lunch. Something like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the only new thing that's happened since the last time we recorded roughly an hour ago.
All right, let's go. Let's get it.
All right, so when we last left off, Stephen Paul Jobs was petulant, rolling around Reed College, taking classes that he wanted to, not the ones that he was assigned to. He had met his good friend Daniel Kotke, and he had also sort of taken on a mentor in Robert Friedland, who a lot of his charisma really rubbed off on Jobs. We will talk about this later, but according to people who knew them both, they would go on to say that Jobs learned his reality distortion field, which is something that will come into play later, and we will go into a little bit more. But he learned that from Friedland.
Definitely sounds like something from Dragon Ball.
Yeah, it does. But also, quick side note on Friedland. We didn't mention the last time because, I mean, it's not necessary to the story, but I just think it's a fun fact that he goes on later in life to become this mining billionaire executive guy, and Jobs actually always kind of regarded him as kind of like a
sleazy
slime ball type guy, even later in life. So again, just a quick digression for you, but we'll pick up with Jobs now. Having returned to live with his parents after his stint at Reed College. So he's still young, he'd only been there for 18 months. So he's, probably less than 2 years out of high school at this time, but he was back and he was still, he hadn't really been doing a lot of electronic stuff at Reed. He had been more into Zen and acid. He was really into acid and other drugs, but he had taken to exploring more like literature and philosophy and that sort of stuff than electronics, but he was still very talented and very bright. And there were a ton of jobs for people like him around the valley at the time. So he was just thinking about where he'd like to work. And he's like, I kind of like video games. So he thought, I will try to go and get a job at Atari. And, when I try to get a job, I go through the application process. You
wait a while.
You wait, you give them a couple days to respond. You maybe you follow up very politely. And then
that's usually when they tell you, Mr. Ginella, I don't think this is going to work out.
Wow. That's rude.
I'm sorry.
That's not always what happens.
Not even normally.
But, and then you get an interview and you go and you wear your suit or you dress nicely at the very least, and you go in very politely and you say, hi, I'm here for my interview. And then you get this interview and then maybe you get hired. This is not the route that Steve Jobs took. We talked about the fact that Jobs was real into just eating fruit and not wearing shoes and stuff. But one thing we didn't talk about was the fact that he believed that because of his vegetarian diet, his body did not produce mucus or body odor. And so he rarely bathed and never wore deodorant or shoes. So back to Atari, when he's like, I'd like to work there, he just walks up into the lobby, like no application, no appointment, no anything. And he's like, I'm not leaving until someone gives me a job.
And somehow this works.
Well, yeah. So like security gets a hold of like the head engineer at Atari named Al Alcorn. And they were like, we got this hippie guy in here who said he's not leaving until we get a job. Should we call the cops? And he was like, no, send him in. I'll talk to him. And Alcorn liked him enough that he hired him on as a technician making $5 an hour. And Steve Jobs became one of Atari's first 50 employees.
Now, Steve was not a pleasure to work with. Not by a long shot. He was, we've already talked about how kind of brash and confident he was, but, realistically speaking, he was a little bit of a jerk. A lot of a jerk.
Yeah, a lot of a jerk.
And, Arif already touched on this. His hygiene at this point in time wasn't exactly something to be desired. So, obviously it's tough to be in a room with him, not only because of his personality, but because of what was likely a very strong
odor.
Odor that was emanating from his body. So this made it tough. And, one thing that they did to make this work out was they just moved him to the night shift.
Yeah, because like the other engineers who were quote unquote straight laced, probably just like normal dudes, they wanted to get him fired, but Alcorn really liked him. And the guy who had founded Atari, Nolan Bushnell, also really liked Steve because they were kind of both into philosophy and that sort of stuff. And so they didn't want to fire him. And he was also good at his job.
Yeah.
So they were just like, but we can't have you around other humans. So, so they moved him to the night shift. And like, even still, he, despite like not being around people, managed to seek people out to rub the wrong way at Atari. But at least it was apparently doable.
So anybody out there that's listening, this is how you follow the Steve Jobs kind of line to success. Just, you need a job, just go wherever you need to go. Barge in the office and say, yeah, give me a job.
And then tell everyone they're stupid.
So, he works at Atari for a while, but ultimately his desire is to travel to India and, to seek out.
Atari was just a way to get that cash so that he can go find his guru.
So go find the real guru, a real spiritual advisor. So, like any employee would do, you'd say, hey, man, here's my 2 weeks. I'm going to take off and go to India. But, not Steve Jobs. Steve goes into Alcorn's office and he basically sits down and says, listen, man, I'm going to India and I need you, Atari, to pay for it. And,
logical.
Right. Now, Alcorn, who's surely amused at this point in time, says, what any boss would say, like, no, I don't see that happening.
No chance.
But in some strange twist of fate, I guess, he does make a suggestion that kind of works out for both Steve and Al.
He at least had need for jobs across the Atlantic.
Right. So basically they wanted to sell these Atari game units.
Well, they'd already sold them.
Well, yeah, they're already selling them, but there's one kind of glaring problem with the units that they're selling in Europe.
The issue was specifically in Munich that the machines were having issues because the games, most, at the time it was Pong, their most popular game. It was designed at the American speed of 60 frames per second, and in Europe they ran on 50.
Now,
frames.
Like, this is wild to me because, like, frame rates. I don't know if any of you listeners out there play video games. Like, frame rates are kind of a big deal nowadays, and by kind of, I mean they are a big deal. Like, people are like, man, my game's not running at 92 frames per second. Like, I can't deal with this. So obviously, that 10 frame difference was causing an issue.
And Alcorn had devised a solution for it. He just didn't have anyone there to implement the solution, and so he was like, hey,
I'll send you to West Germany to work this out, and then you can find your own way to India.
Yeah. I mean, he was like, it got to be cheaper to get from Germany to India than it is from here to India. And
so Jobs finds himself in West Germany, and he's working out this problem, but while he's doing it, he's pissing the Germans off the best he can, So, Steve has been living this life where he's got a very special diet, right? He's living off of, he's a vegetarian by this point in time, but more extreme than,
He's like a Caricatarian.
Right. He was very upset at the fact that the Germans were trying to feed him meat and potatoes, and he falsely makes the claim that there is no word in German for vegetarian.
There's a word for everything in German. Okay, there's no
Those German speakers out there are really getting a chuckle out of that one.
Right, like there's no concept that the Germans do not have a specific word for, so Steve was completely incorrect in this. But
he solves their problem.
Yeah, he solves their problem, and it's funny because they also called to complain to Alcorn about Jobs. They're like, he's rude and he smells terrible. But Alcorn was like, yeah, but he solved the problem, didn't he? And they're like,
yeah.
And he's like, all right, great. If you have any more, I got a whole legion of dudes just like him that I'll send. And they're like, no, we'll just handle it ourselves.
Moving forward, the Germans probably fixed all their own Ataris after that.
That's right.
But also, Jobs managed to get to India.
Yeah, so he did a quick detour. I think he made one more stop for Atari, and then he actually met Friedland's uncle, I believe, as well while he was over in Europe. But then he headed off to India to seek enlightenment. Daniel Kotke, his friend from Reed, also joined him there, and they had adventures. They did not find the guru they were searching for. They did spend a lot of time studying Zen, though, in different places and just kind of exploring India and that sort of thing. And, one thing we'll see about Jobs going forward, and it's another distinction between him and Wozniak actually, is their like ideas of friendship and the value they place on friends and people in their lives and that sort of thing. And Jobs has been kind of known to completely like abandon his friends.
Not a whole lot of stock put into the friend.
No, and Wozniak was the opposite. But in India, it was brought up by Isaacson that like this was very different. And I don't know if it was just because Jobs was there and like it was just him and Kotke that were kind of like alone together there because like they didn't speak the language. It was just like the two of them, but they were very close. And like Kotke remembers Jobs very fondly, specifically in India. And like at one point, Jobs was preparing to leave, and Kotke, I believe, was going to stay on a little bit longer. And Kotke gets robbed or something like that and loses all his money, and Jobs just gives him all of his. And he's like, "You just hang on to this." And
yeah, I mean, I would bet that it's just that kind of isolation of being the two foreigners, and I mean, because look,
strangers in a strange land.
Yeah, I've been there, man, and like some of your friends, like some of my friends that I met in China, like super tight bonds, just because like you're both going through this thing, and it's like when you need to express yourself, like this is the only person that I can easily express myself to, and kind of gets where I'm coming from. I would bet that's it.
Yeah,
but as we've noted before, he did not find a spiritual advisor or guru in India.
No, so he decides that, it's not happening. I'll continue my search elsewhere. So he heads home.
This is early 75.
Yeah. And so he heads home, and of course he doesn't let anyone know that he's coming. He just calls his parents when he arrives and is like, hey, I'm at the airport. Can you come get me? And they drive to go get him at the airport. And it's funny because Isaacson describes when they come back in contact with each other at the airport, they didn't even recognize him because he had spent so much time outside. He was way darker than when he left, and like I think he had shaved his head, and he was wearing like traditional Indian robes and stuff like that. So they were like, I don't know who this person is, but it was Steve. And so they take him back, and so he's living with them again, and he actually ends up finding a spiritual advisor right in, I believe it was in Palo Alto, and his name was, go ahead, Melvin.
Why am I? Okay. His name was Kobun Chino Otagawa.
See?
That was not good. But, yeah, so he flew 8,000 miles, roughly, or so, give or take, I don't know, 1,000 miles, to India to find a spiritual advisor, and then came back and found one.
In his backyard.
Right.
But I mean, Kobun was the real deal as far as Jobs was concerned, and he studied under him a lot, spent a ton of time with him, and they were close up until the day that Otagawa died. He even like oversaw Jobs' eventual wedding, and they were very close, and Jobs was very happy with him. Jobs being back in California, needs a job.
Where do you go when you need a job?
Hey man, you go right back to Atari. And this time, he didn't need to just demand his job back. He just shows up. He's got a copy of Be Here Now, and he's like, Al, A, I need my job back. B, I need you to read this book. Alcorn was glad to see him back. Even though Jobs was not a pleasure to work with, he was good at his job, and they were happy to give Jobs his position back right on the night shift, away from everyone else.
Now, Jobs is back at Atari, and he's back at his usual job ways of terrorizing everyone there.
Just insulting everyone.
Right. So Al Alcorn and Nolan Bushnell realized we need to give Jobs a project. Obviously, they needed this job done, but they also needed to just kind of keep him preoccupied so that he wouldn't, make everyone else want to murder him. So they give him the task of designing a single-player version of Pong, and they know that he's close friends with Wozniak. So they're banking on the fact that if we give him this task, he's going to pull Wozniak in. Who, I mean, they had faith that Jobs could do it, but they knew that Wozniak could
do it better.
Yeah, could really do it.
Well, because also at the time, Woz had his like dream job. Like all he wanted to ever be was an HP engineer. And
that's what he was.
And that's exactly what he was. And he would get off his shift. And, we mentioned the fact that Woz, was kind of not a necessarily like social butterfly or whatever. So he would get off his shift. He would go and like eat dinner or whatever. Then he would come over to Atari and hang out with Jobs while he was doing his night shift thing. And they knew that this single player version of Pong should take, a while to develop, and it might be expensive to do. So they were thinking to themselves, like, we know Woz, who had developed a reputation for how good he was around the area, that, I bet you we could get this 2-for-1 deal.
So they get it without paying Woz.
Well, they told Jobs, they were like, we need this done in 4 days.
Right. And they did it in 4 days, which is
with very little sleep.
With 4 days, very little sleep, and with less materials than they actually had thought it would take. So basically Jobs ends up receiving this bonus for getting this done. And he tells Woz that he'd split the money with him 50-50 straight down the middle. What Jobs actually ends up doing is he splits basically the base pay and doesn't mention anything about the bonus, that the additional money that Woz was central to them earning. So this is just kind of one of those first early examples of, Jobs really being willing to kind of
screw over his friends.
Who
pretty much made this possible in the first place.
Right. I mean, you're leaning on his genius. And I think that, the part that's kind of really interesting is that it wasn't even so much so that the issue of the money. It's just like the honesty.
Yeah. And, this came back years later. Wozniak found this out and he was really hurt by it. And this was after Apple and, all this stuff. And he was just like, to him, you don't do that to a friend. Had Steve needed the money, which is what Wozniak assumed after learning about it, that he just needed the money, like Woz would have
told him keep all of it.
Yeah, it's just like, you don't do that to your friends.
Right. I mean, it wasn't like Woz was out on the street at that point in time. He's got a great job at HP. I mean, I think that hurt him, but it does say a little bit or a lot about the type of friend that Steve Jobs was.
Yeah. So March of 1975, right around the time of the whole single-player Pong deal, Woz and one of his friends from HP, Alan Baum, attended the first ever meeting of the Homebrew Computer Club, which was like held in someone's garage. It actually ended up being a pretty big thing, but the first ever was in someone's garage, and it was just for a like-minded group of engineers who wanted to talk about what they were working on in their spare time. Because the thing with electronics and like, I don't even want to say personal computers because that wasn't really a thing then, but people who were into like computers and that sort of stuff, it was a very hacker type thing. It was a very hobbyist centered thing. I know it's hard to think about, especially for me. Even I didn't have a computer in our house until I was 10 years old. But like 10 on, there's just been more and more computers. And like today in 2018, while we're recording this, you can't reach your arm out without touching a computer. You know what I mean? Like, but at the time, computers weren't common, and like you were,
Yeah, I mean, in fact, they were intimidating. Like the average American wasn't.
You were a mathematician if you were working on a computer.
Yeah, like, and they weren't just these things that were everywhere. You know what I mean? They were, they were on college campuses. You didn't just have a computer in your living room that you were gonna like. What are you doing?
Yeah,
with
I mean,
it?
like the average American would go their like entire lives probably without using a computer.
And I mean, I think the next level down from like the mathematicians are maybe, you have like businessmen.
Well, I mean, honestly, though, like businessmen didn't even really touch this stuff until the Apple II, which we'll talk about. And like VisiCalc, I think, was like the first spreadsheet software. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Back to the Homebrew Computer Club. This was important because this was the first time that Wozniak had ever seen a microprocessor, and he just immediately started thinking about like all the possibilities and what he could build using a microprocessor. And Melvin and I are not technical folks, so we are not going to dig into what
the ins and outs of
microprocessors and that sort of thing, but more or less, and it's explained in Isaacson's book if you want to pick it up or just Google it. It gave Wozniak the idea that what we consider a personal computer today was possible. And so he kind of set out doing these sketches of like a board that he could build this microprocessor on to maybe have something that would resemble what you would consider like a desktop today.
Yeah, and I think what's important and interesting about it is that all of the different packages were brought into one.
Sort of. It was like a circuit board, really.
Yeah.
It was like what he was sketching out. And then, at the time, like that was what the computer was just that circuit board. And then if you wanted to add a keyboard, you could do that. You could attach the keyboard and you could attach a monitor.
But at least it was conceptualized at this point in time. It was just the board.
Yeah, it was just a circuit board. And so he would work on this in all his spare time. Again, being a genius, he was also like completely in love with doing this sort of stuff. We didn't mention before, but I mean, I'm sure it's not surprising to anyone that when Jobs had approached him about the whole single player Pong thing, he was pumped because like he built games for himself all the time, and like not because he liked to play the games. He just liked to build them. He was truly doing what he loved. And so he builds this out in his spare time at HP, and then he starts to write the software for it. But like at the time, today you can go to download any like open source type deal to start like writing code and stuff. But at the time, like you couldn't. Like it was expensive. You had to pay for time to do that. And so when he didn't have the money, he would just write it on like by hand. So Woz worked on that for a few months after that initial meeting at Homebrew Computer Club, and he eventually, after those few months, hit this major breakthrough in the history of computing. Really, in his own words, I typed a few keys on the keyboard and I was shocked. The letters were displayed on the screen. It was Sunday, June 29th, 1975, a milestone for the personal computer. It was the first time in history that anyone had ever typed a character on a keyboard and seen it shown up on the computer's screen right in front of them.
It's the little things, man.
Well, that's crazy, though, to think about that. I mean, again, I said I had a computer I've been around computers since I was like 10 years old. The first computer I ever used was the original iMac that was like translucent blue. And then we had a Dell or something like that at my house. But you could type on the keyboard and the letters pop right up and you didn't think anything of it. But this was the first time that was ever possible. And it's just crazy to think about that.
Yeah. And it's also kind of interesting to think when you think about how computers developed. To me, I was like, that was the beginning, right? Like that
was the first one, right?
Thing,
but
right?
I mean, if you really want to go back, it's actually funny. I was like watching some of these and they're really good. PBS ran this like YouTube series or whatever on like the history of computing. And they actually start with what they call the first computer, which is the abacus. And they really talk about like how the actual meaning of a computer was really just for like math, and like the abacus was just for like keeping track of complex math, and then like people were computers.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've been telling you to see Hidden Figures for a long time, and I don't know if you ever have or not, but the women of NASA, that was their title. They were computers because they were just mathematicians, and like professional mathematicians a lot of times were called computers. And then as it grows and changes,
people computers.
Yeah, we end up with the machine, the computer, and it begins more or less as a high-powered calculator for making like complex calculations, and then it becomes what it is today.
So what do you do with this grandiose technology, with this breakthrough? Obviously, Wozniak is like, hey, I'm going to take this to the homebrew guys. I'm going to share it with all of these guys that we've been meeting with. And
that was the thing, though. That was the whole hacker ethos.
This is the hacker ethos that we mentioned in the last episode, and that you didn't just keep ideas to yourself. you shared them with the people around you so that you could continue to kind of move the field forward.
This was open source.
Exactly. Now, it's also important to remember that the people that he's in this group with, at the time, they're nobodies, but they become movers and shakers of the field. They're in this group with the likes of, go on and tell them, Eric.
One notable member of Homebrew was Bill Gates.
The Bill Gates.
Yeah. And he, as we'll discuss in a moment, like Jobs, was not about this
open source mentality.
Yeah. So one of the things that was a catalyst for the club was the Altair 8800, which was a microcomputer, which was not actually small. I just think it's funny that it was considered a microcomputer and was actually pretty large. But and you could mail order this thing and it would come and
you assemble it yourself.
You assemble that thing, but again, super like open source. You can do all kinds of stuff to it. And Bill Gates and his friend Paul Allen invented a version of BASIC code that you could write for the Altair. And he found out that all these people at Homebrew were just like taking his code, and he was like, "You guys aren't paying me." And like,
right?
Come on, this is professional work. Like this is
like, guys, I didn't do this for free,
right? And so he writes this like scathing letter, like open letter to the Homebrew Club about how they can pay up whenever they feel like it. But,
yeah. So at this point in time, Jobs and Gates they're kind of on the same page with this, and Wozniak wants to take this development to the Homebrew guys, and Jobs is like, "Listen,
I want to take it to him too.
We need to not. We need to not do this.
I want to take it to them, but then I want to take their money."
Right. So Jobs does his best to kind of make sure that Wozniak does not share the secrets to what he's done.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing that Jobs did, and again, like, Jobs was very charismatic and very good at sort of convincing people in general, but also Wozniak, of seeing things his way. And, he's like, Woz, this is complicated. Like, no one's as smart as you. If you show up and like try to show people this, they're not going to appreciate it. We need to build this for them. Because like, he wasn't going to just like show up with the board. He was going to show them like the schematics of the board and like, guys, like this is how you could build your own.
Right.
And he's like, no. No one wants that. They want us to build it for them and then sell it to them, and they can take it from there if they want.
And this kind of starts the small beginnings of Apple.
Yeah. And they started selling some of these computers to people at the Homebrew Club. Going forward, I'm going to refer to them as the Apple One, because that is what they became, but they didn't actually have that name yet. So they started making these sales, and it became apparent to Jobs, at least, that this could be more than just a few things that we sell. Like, we could actually sell a bunch of these probably. So they formed a partnership, and that partnership was Apple Computer. The name, they were bouncing all these names around, trying to figure out what they were going to call it, and they had some technology sounding names, but to Jobs, it was really important to kind of take the edge off the word computer. He realized that the term at the time was intimidating, and that, computers weren't like a friendly thing. So he wanted it to sound friendly and inviting, because in Jobs' mind, like, computers could be everywhere. And I don't think he realized at that point just how widespread like the personal computer would end up being, but he definitely kind of had an inkling of it. So he decided that he had just come back from Friedland's farm, another stint, pruning Gravestein apple trees, or Gravenstein, or however you say it. And he was like, why don't we call it Apple Computer? Apples are friendly words. So that's what they settled on. And
it also got them ahead of Atari in the phone book.
That was also important, because phone books are important then, which is funny. But so they settle on Apple. Jobs is ready to dive right in. They needed some money to build some of these initial circuit boards. And so Woz sells this calculator that he had, which is not like a handheld calculator, it was a large machine. And then, of course, Jobs had a Volkswagen bus, because, of course, Jobs had a Volkswagen bus. And he sold that to get their initial money. And Woz, he was definitely in it, like, in terms of building these things with Jobs, but he wasn't ready to just jump.
His job. He wanted to dip the toe in.
He lived his whole life wanting to be an HP engineer, and he had it. His life was set as far as he was concerned, and he just wasn't ready to let go. So Jobs was like, I'm going to need reinforcement. And so he had a friend at Atari. One of the few people that could stand him at Atari was a guy named Ron Wayne, who had previously started like a slot machine company or something like that ended up going bankrupt. But he and Jobs were good friends, and Jobs kind of viewed him as knowledgeable in terms of starting a business because he had started one. And so he brought him in as a third partner. and he asked Ron to help them draft like a partnership agreement. Jobs was so appreciative of the way that Ron was able to help him coax Woz not to leave his job, but to at least join the partnership, that he made Ron a 10% stakeholder in Apple. And Ron, he was on board for like a day. At the time the company wasn't worth anything, but that's 10%. And so
you gotta get in your time machine, man.
Whew, man. So Ron drafts this document and he's all in for like a day. And then
marinating on it.
Yeah. He was upset by the fact that, upset is probably not the right word. He was unsettled by the fact that they weren't incorporating. They were just like a regular partnership or whatever. So like legally,
they took all the risk. I mean,
they could be sued and they could lose their personal assets. So it's not like an LLC where you're like, well, you have personal protection in some cases. Ron was also like,
God, this is where it gets strange, right?
Well, he was like an early version of like a doomsday prepper sort of. And like, so he man held like gold bars that he hid under his mattress. And so he was afraid that if Apple got in any legal trouble, people would come after him.
He loses gold coins.
Yeah, and I mean, he had run a failed business before, and those were fresh wounds. So he went back down to the courthouse or wherever, and he wrote himself out the deal. And Jobs and Wozniak effectively bought him out for absolutely nothing, pretty much. But had Ron kept his 10% stake in Apple today, as we record this in 2018, it would be worth approximately $84 billion with a B dollars. And Isaacson really paints him as like a sympathetic figure in the biography. Like, I guess when he was writing it, Wayne was like living on the outskirts of Vegas, just like living off Social Security check. But at the same time, it's important to note that Wayne kept that initial partnership agreement and sold it at auction for like $1.6 million. So he wasn't struggling that hard.
So on April 1st, 1976, the Apple Computer Partnership was officially formed. Now, they go from there and they present their Apple I computer at Homebrew, and they're expecting fireworks. They're expecting the crowd to bow down and acknowledge what they're seeing before them. But this is not what happened. Basically, they present their design and they get, basically there's crickets, but one person is a little bit interested, and that's Paul Terrell. So he hangs out after the talk and he talks to them about their computers, and he gives them his card and he says, you know what, like, stay in touch. Maybe we can do some business in the future. And by in the future, Jobs interpreted that as tomorrow. So Jobs,
without shoes on,
shows up at Terrell's shop, which is called the Byte Shop, and proceeds to talk to him about purchasing the Apple I computers. And to Jobs' surprise and enjoyment, he agrees ultimately to purchase a number of the Apple I boards at $500 a piece. But the problem is Terrell doesn't actually understand what he's getting. He's under the impression that he's getting the fully built finished product. He thinks he's getting the monitor, the keyboards, all of that. What he's actually supposed to get are the boards.
Just the boards.
Now, obviously, Jobs is ecstatic about the order, but they don't have a whole lot of money. They don't have the money to actually buy the parts that they need to fill the order. So they stand to make about a $10,000 profit, but they need to first come up with the money to buy the $15,000 worth of parts.
Yeah, it's funny. In Isaacson's book, he recounts how Jobs went to the place where he was going to buy the parts for it, and they were like, absolutely not. I'm not selling you this, you Ho Chi Minh looking hippie who smells bad. And
now, please tell me that he just showed up and was like, I need these parts ahead of time.
Yeah.
I'll pay you later.
Yeah, he tried to go and, get it on credit. And they're like, I'm not giving you credit. You don't look like someone worthy of credit.
You think you would like throw on like a suit, something.
Nothing. You would think, but you would be wrong. And so he finally goes the roundabout way of getting Terrell to tell this person that he's trying to buy these parts off of that, yes, in fact, he had made this large order. And so he was able to eventually get the parts on credit.
So from there, they take their show on the road.
Well, first, they got to build these things. And
oh, yeah, that's right.
And they didn't have...
They don't have a crew.
No, it was just the two of them still, really. And so they start, recruiting.
Recruiting buddies, man.
Yeah, they get Daniel, who is now living in in the valley, and they get some neighborhood kids, and
the garage turns into the factory floor.
That's right. They start building it out in Paul and Claire's garage. And it's funny because I feel like when you think about the startup culture and stuff, it's like it's in the garage now. And you know what I mean? And like that's really like this is where it started.
They legit built 50 Apple I computers in a garage.
And you know, the garage had been Paul's workshop. And so he cleared it out for them, and they just got to work building these things. And this was Apple. And it was in a garage in
1976.
Yeah.
Well, and then it gets better in that like they build all of these computers, right? And then they show back up at Terrell's place, you know, the bite shop, and they're like, "So check it out, like,
check it out,
what
man.
do you think?
How sick are these?"
And he's like, "Bro, these don't even have power supplies. Like, what am I supposed to do with this?
What is this?"
And you know,
he almost didn't buy it.
He almost didn't buy it, but somehow Jobs managed to get this guy to buy, you know, essentially incomplete, in his mind, incomplete computers.
Well, and my understanding of it is that Jobs kind of pitched it to him as like, look, like you're going to sell them this board for however much that you were going to price it for, and now you're going to sell them a monitor and a keyboard and a power supply, because this is not complete. I mean, it has potential to be awesome, but people who are going to buy this are going to spend a lot of money here. And so Terrell ended up taking
a pretty strong argument.
Yeah, I mean, it is. And it's funny too, because the price of the Apple One was $666.66.
Mark of the beast.
Yeah, man. So like Woz and Jobs never struck me as conservative Christians or necessarily interested in that sort of thing at all. And they were certainly not familiar with the book of Revelation. Unfortunately for them, the blockbuster The Omen had come out in 1976. And so 666 had entered the public consciousness as the mark of the beast. And so people were upset by this price. I just think it didn't really deter anyone who was going to buy it from buying it, but I just thought it was kind of funny that there were complaints about how much
people worried, like, can you believe this?
This demonic machine.
They're over here taking over the youth's minds.
The youths. But anyway, regardless of the fact that he had made the sale to Terrell at the bite shop, Jobs realized sort of that Terrell was probably onto something about needing to sell people an entire unit and not just these things. And so they take their show on the road. They attend the Personal Computer Festival in Atlantic City, which is described in very underwhelming detail in Isaacson's book. I feel like Atlantic City usually is, but it was kind of like a tired old hotel, and that's where it was held. But it gave them a chance to kind of feel out the competition and see what was going on. And
they put up a hell of a display.
Yeah, and you know they did. Jobs was an excellent showman, but he had seen that another computer in particular had like a finished unit, sort of the kind of thing that Terrell had been asking for.
SOL 20.
Yeah, and Isaacson sort of describes this as like a machine that looks like it was built by grown-ups, whereas like the Apple I even set up the way that they had it for the show, like with its wooden case and that sort of thing. It looked like
it had been built in the garage by a hippie.
Exactly. Not like a very professionally like finished product. And
so let's take a moment to read the quote of what this machine looked like, and let's think into the future about an Apple product.
Go ahead, Melvin.
Sleek metal case, a keyboard, a power supply, and cables. Ignore the last three parts, but a sleek metal case.
The sleek and metal case. And, you know, another thing that this served, besides making them realize that they needed their own sleek metal case and other things, was that Wozniak had been building the next iteration of his computer, which is the Apple II, which became a major step forward in personal computing. But he realized that all these other computers here couldn't shine a light on the Apple II. So it was kind of a big confidence boost to Wozniak that they were also going to be able to turn this into a very legitimate and lucrative business.
So now Jobs and Wozniak have the Apple II, but it's going to cause them some...
Well, they have the design.
They have the design, but it's going to cause them some serious problems because now they've designed it to be the total package. It's supposed to come with the monitor, the keyboard, and it's going to be fully assembled. All the good stuff. But the problem is that it's a little bit over their head. They don't have the money to actually produce these units and get them out. So they start to kind of visit some of the companies around town again, and they're looking at this point in time to actually sell the entire company. They start off at Atari, and in typical Jobs fashion, he walks into Keenan's office and puts his feet immediately on his desk and tries to go about selling Apple to Keenan and Atari.
His dirty bare feet. mind you.
On his desk. Not shoes, none of that.
Not socks.
And like you might suspect, Keenan says no.
Yeah. And real quick, just to interject, this is a theme for Apple that...
Putting your feet on people's desks?
Well, not putting your feet on people's desk, but like other people and companies completely whiffing on the opportunity to become very, 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 very wealthy. You know, we didn't mention this before, but like one of the things when they were originally forming this partnership, when Wozniak was working on the Apple I, he felt obligated to try to sell it to, or not even sell it, just give it to HP. And so he ran it by his boss, who took it and then, you know, got him a meeting with the big wigs. And they were like, this is really cool, but it's like a hobbyist thing. Like, this is not what we do at HP. Like, we're business focused. And then, you know, we talked about Ron Wayne getting out early, could have been a billionaire. And then now we have this run of folks. So go ahead, Melvin.
As you read through the book, I'm sure you just see this list of people where you're like, I hurt for them.
Oh, you do.
The billions that they missed out on. So after that, they end up with a meeting with Chuck Peddle. He came over to Jobs' house on behalf of the Commodore Computing Company, and they showed him a demo of what they had. And, he was impressed, and Jobs, in, again, typical Jobs fashion, says, yeah, you might want to buy us out for $200,000. And I think Peddle was a little taken back by this.
Also, he was in front of the board at this time. Peddle had taken him and he's like, come and present to my bosses over at Commodore. Mm-hmm. And they were like, yeah, this is great, but also we're Commodore and like we can build our own.
Right. This is a great idea. We'll take it and do something ourselves with it.
But theirs was trash. And at this point, there's kind of a rift. I don't know if that's the right word, but that's what I'm going with, between Woz and Jobs, because Woz was never in it for the money. He was in it because he loved engineering. And he was kind of, I don't know if naive is the right word either, but he wasn't like a sharp business mind like Jobs was. And his dad was a little different. And his dad kind of felt like you have Jobs, who is not done anything really in his view. His son had built these machines, and all Jobs is a glorified salesman in his opinion. And now when they're trying to sell their company, to sell another one of his son's great products, Jobs is comporting himself in a way that is chasing off potential buyers. And so one day at the Wozniak residence, Woz's dad actually confronts Jobs about it. And so Jobs does what Jobs usually does when faced with confrontation, and he begins to cry. And, he starts telling Steve Wozniak, he's like, if you don't think that I'm worth anything, then we can just dissolve this right now. His dad had been pushing for Jobs to take a much lesser stake in the company, and he was like, it's either 50-50 or nothing. And Wozniak made the wise decision to keep the partnership what it was, because even early on, he recognized that he wasn't a salesman. He wasn't necessarily a design and market visionary like Jobs was. He was certainly the engineering mind behind all this stuff, but he wasn't going to sell these products like Jobs would. And so they kept it as it was. At this point, also, they had kind of given up on the idea of selling the company. It was apparent that people weren't willing to pay what they believed it was worth. And so they kind of pivoted to finding an outside investor to become like a third partner or something like that would be able to fund them. And so they needed a rich guy. So they go back to Atari's founder, Nolan Bushnell, who I don't think I've mentioned this, but would later go on to found perhaps the happiest place on earth, Chuck E. Cheese. But he sat down and he took this pitch from Jobs, and he wasn't feeling it. He was offered a 1/3 stake for $50,000, which would have been so much money if he had just taken it. Billions and billions and billions. But he didn't. And so they need another guy. And they were recommended a man named Mike Markkula.
Now, Mike was an investment type. He'd retired by the age of 33, something like that. God, wouldn't that be nice? Mm. And he had a lot of money on hand.
He had been in the industry.
He'd been around the block a couple of times. So he met with Jobs and Woz, and he immediately recognized the promise that the Apple II had. And he showed some willingness to actually get some teeth in the game and to back the project.
Despite the fact that, in his words, Steve Jobs looked like an unkempt version of Ho Chi Minh.
Well, that's how you know the brilliance is there, man.
Yeah.
So he ends up actually giving these guys. Now, remember, the big problem that they had was they didn't have the money to actually produce the machines that they needed. he decides that he will invest $250,000 to help them kind of get these Apple IIs off the ground. And what he ends up becoming is a 1/3.
Yeah, it was equal partnership.
Yeah, equal partnership with Woz and Jobs. Now they're all, 26% owners, and then the remaining space is there for future shareholders. So obviously they see room for growth there. So in January of 1977, the three of them buy out the original partnership that initially was Apple, and it becomes the sort of Apple Corporation that we know.
Yeah, the modern Apple.
Today. And at this point in time, Woz finally leaves his dream job at HP and begins to work for Apple full-time. And this is a significant change. And one other big change that they go through at this point in time is Markkula kind of starts to serve as a mentor for Jobs. And he imparts this idea that kind of greatness is something that you should impute. If you're going to produce something, you need to produce it to the highest quality that you can. And this kind of goes back to, some of those values that Steve got from his father at a young age. And this is really evident in the marketing company that they choose to kind of develop Apple's initial logo. And this, they go to Regis McKenna, the hot premier
and he
marketing
did not
expert.
He did not want to take Apple on at first, and Jobs just harassed him until he did.
Yeah, and it worked out well for everyone because he produced the iconic Apple logo that we have today, right?
Yeah, and the original,
the
original one was the same logo, except that the color scheme was like the psychedelic bars, and Jobs really liked that idea, and they had gone with this ad firm or whatever McKenna really was. I don't know if it was. I think it was like PR and like advertising kind of like rolled into one type deal, but he was definitely above the pay grade of most startup computer companies. But the idea that a high quality product like the Apple II that they were building deserved and required a high quality agency like McKenna's. And this continued on to the first launch event for Apple at the West Coast Computer Fair. And, it's funny because, that was in April 1977. And today, when there's a launch event for Apple, it's like a holy day.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, these things are huge. And especially when Steve Jobs was still alive, whenever when there was one of these things, people tuned in. People rushed to get there. It was like the biggest thing ever. Like if you weren't there, you were constantly refreshing your browser or Twitter to see what's the new iPhone gonna be and that sort of thing. But this was not that. This was just this computer fair pretty much. And Jobs again, he took the idea of imputing greatness to heart, and he was like, we're gonna do this. I'm spending the extra money. I think it was $5,000 or whatever to get the most prominent table at the thing, and they blew their competition out of the water. At this point, most of their competitors had stuff that looked more like the Apple I than the Apple II, and Steve had set up this black velvet table with their big Apple logo behind them on very clean looking plexiglass. They had a few units built, but then they had boxes and boxes, empty boxes, stacked to make it look like they had a bunch ready to go out. And it was a huge success. People absolutely loved it, clamoring about it. Everyone that was there, they ended up selling 300 units right there. And, at this point, this is when Apple is a real company. It
becomes Apple.
Yeah. I mean, even, at this event, they also even meet the guy who would be Apple's first dealer in Japan. Right now is kind of when they're quote unquote legit. They have some employees, they have a line of credit. They had, by this point, moved out of the garage to a small office. And with this, Jobs' ego had kind of grown right along with Apple, and he had really become dictatorial in his management style. He was very harsh and abrasive when dealing with the people he worked with. He also hadn't improved his hygiene at all. And one of his methods for relaxing and to lower his stress level while at the office was that he would go and stand barefoot in the toilets. And I don't really understand that at all.
You gotta soak them bunions, man.
In a toilet, though?
Yeah, no, I mean, not there.
And, those were the same feet that he constantly just put up on tables in front of people in meetings and stuff. And that was what it was like working with Steve Jobs in the early days. But I think that's where we're going to leave it. Apple is arrived in a small way. Steve Jobs is standing in toilets. And that's a good point, as good as any to stop.
I'm just stuck on the toilets.
Just stuck on the toilets. All right. Well, then next week we will pick up there. So thank you very much for tuning in, and we will see you next week.
Toodles. Hey, before we take off, I just want to remind you guys how you can support the show. First, you can rate, review, and tell a friend, and also follow us on social media.
Especially Twitter. We're at the Life of X Podcast. Additionally, you can head over to lifeofxpodcast.com/support, where you will find portals to audible.com, amazon.com, and patreon.com. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Audible is a gigantic and wonderful audiobook website. You can receive a free audiobook when you sign up through our website. If you go through our Amazon portal, any purchases that you make, Amazon kicks us a small percentage of that. And finally, you can head over to our Patreon page where you can sign up to make a contribution to the show on a per episode basis. We appreciate your support. Thank you.